Greetings, social media kindred in spirit. I am Deborah M. Stewart Elias, a custodian of the promptings of the divine mind and preparation for the wedding feast associated with Matthew 22, 1 through 14 for the bride of Christ via the application of the principles of Jesus to obtain Christ consciousness. The order of business for today is the introduction to Philemon. Philemon is Paul's only letter of a private nature. It concerns a runaway slave, Onesimus, who robbed his master, Philemon, and escaped from Colossae to Rome. There, Onesimus met the imprisoned apostle, Paul. Paul wrote to Philemon concerning Onesimus. Paul sent both the letter and Onesimus back to Colossae. By comparison to Paul's other letters, Philemon is little more than a postcard, but it comes from the tender heart of a friend writing as a friend rather than as an apostle exercising his authority. The circumstances of writing. The author. During Paul's 2-year imprisonment in Rome, verified in Acts chapter 28, verse 30, probably during AD 60 through 61, he wrote 4 prison epistles, one of which was Philemon. The others were Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippians. The background. References to Paul's being in prison at the time of writing are found in verses 1, 9 through 10 and 13, and perhaps 23. Paul was kept under house arrest, what the Romans called free custody, in his own rented house as he awaited trial, verified in Acts chapter 28, verse 30. Although Paul addresses the letter to Apphia, Archippus, and the church that meets in Philemon's house, in verses 1 through 2, the main addressee is Philemon himself, for you or your, verified in verses 2, 4 through 21 and 23, is singular and refers to Philemon. Apparently, he was a prosperous businessman living in Colossae, implied in Colossians chapter 4, verse 9, whose household included several slaves and whose house was large enough to accommodate meetings of the young church. He had been converted through Paul's ministry, perhaps by Paul himself, verified in verses 10 and 19, and he had become Paul's dear friend and co-worker, verified in verse 1, and partner, verified in verse 17, in the gospel service. Although the letter is basically Paul's personal appeal to Philemon and plural you, verified in verses 3:22 and your and 22:25, indicate that the whole church would have listened to its reading and thus been witnesses of Philemon's response to Paul's request. Onesimus had apparently run away and taken with him some of his master's money or possessions, verified in verses 15 and 18. Perhaps attracted by the anatomy of a large, distant city, he traveled to Rome seeking a life of freedom. His path crossed Paul's, and he became a Christian, verified in verses 10 and 16, and a useful helper to Paul, verified in verse 11. An alternative view denies that Onesimus was a runaway looking for freedom. It instead suggests that he left Philemon and looked for Paul so that Paul could become his advocate regarding some serious loss Philemon had experienced. All along, Onesimus had intended to return to his master's household. Paul was therefore not guilty of harboring a fugitive slave. But on this view, he would expect Paul to reassure Philemon that Onesimus had always intended to return. Message and purpose. This letter has served as an inspiration for the liberation of slaves. Paul's clear preference was to keep Onesimus with him, verified in verse 13, but he recognized that Philemon was his legal owner and decided to send him back, verified in verse 12. So Philemon could either reinstate him as a slave, who was now also a Christian brother, verified in verses 15 and 16, or else set him free for further service to Paul back in Rome, verified in verses 13, 20 through 21. Onesimus returned to his master with this letter, knowing that Paul was confident of Philemon's obedience, verified in chapter 21, but also knowing that neither forgiveness, reinstatement, nor emancipation was guaranteed. Philemon's contribution to the Bible. Although it is the shortest and most personal of Paul's letters, Philemon was included in the New Testament canon for several reasons. First, it illustrates the breaking down of social and cultural barriers that occurred between Christians. See Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Paul, a highly educated Roman citizen, takes up the cause of a poor runaway slave whose life was in danger because of his theft and flight, verified in Philemon 18. Social and cultural barriers are eliminated in Christian fellowship. Second, it reflects early Christian attitudes towards slavery. Although Paul accepts but does not endorse slavery as an existing social condition and as a legal fact, verified in verse 12, he emphasizes Onesimus' higher identity as a Christian brother and sets the master-slave relationship on a new footing, verified in verse 16, and so ultimately undermines the institution of slavery. This contrasts with dominant views of the ancient world. For instance, Aristotle defined a slave as a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Third, it shows a skillful pastor at work. Paul gives up his apostolic right to issue commands, verified in verses 8 through 9, and prefers to appeal to Philemon's free choice, verified in verses 10-14, to follow his Christian conscience in deciding how his love should be expressed, verified in verses 5 and 7. He identifies with Onesimus, his spiritual son, verified in verse 10, calling him my very own heart, verified in verse 12, and guaranteeing to repay his debts, verified in 18 through 19, and he gives his request to Philemon in the hearing of the whole local church, verified in verses 1 through 3 and 22 through 25. Fourth, it pictures the heart of the gospel, verified in chapter 16 through 19, and verses 16 through 19. When we come to God in repentance and faith, He gives us a new status and welcomes us as if we were Christ. What we owe God, He has debted to Christ's account. Christ assumed personal responsibility for the full repayment of our debt to God. The structure. Paul's letter to Philemon follows the form of a standard first-century Greek letter addressing and greeting, verified in verses 1 through 3. The body in verses 8 through 12, and closing farewell in verses 21 through 25. Moreover, Paul includes a section of thanksgiving after the greeting, verified in verses 4 through 7, a typical feature found in his letter. Now, the meaning of Philemon is this. It means loving, affectionate, and denotes a thought that belongs to the love nature in man and that becomes attached to the truth of Christ. In Paul's letter to Philemon, what lesson is indicated as necessary to be worked out? Paul appealed to Philemon for clemency toward Onesimus the slave. This portrays the truth that the Word, acting in accord with the forgiving power of the Most High, can bring about freedom on some planes of consciousness. I pray that this introduction to Philemon will assist you in your ascension journey. Till we meet again.